What's up, guys? It's been a while since I've been in front of this beautiful set. Out of all the common PC parts, I would argue that motherboards are the most convoluted. You have to consider so many things: form factor, connectivity, PCI-e, chipset, power delivery, VRM cooling, extra features, and more. Seeing as new motherboard generations for either Intel or AMD come out at least once per year and Alder Lake chips are all the rage at the moment, here's everything that you need to know about motherboards. If you don't know what a motherboard is, it's basically where everything plugs or slots into. It distributes power from your power supply between all the other parts in your system, and it defines which parts can be used in your PC. Motherboards come in 4 main form factors, each with its own advantages and compromises. You will need to make sure your motherboard fits inside your case. You don't want to get a motherboard too big for your case, and you don't want to get a motherboard so small in comparison to your case that it looks silly. Mini ITX is the smallest major form factor. What ITX boards lack in connectivity, they make up for with their compactness. They fit in all except the most extreme small form factor cases, and they've gotten so good today that they're often indistinguishable from ATX boards in terms of features and VRM quality. Micro ATX boards seem to be waning in popularity a bit. They're the next size up, and they're generally the cheapest form factor. MATX boards fit in MATX cases, which are also the cheapest cases usually. If you're on a tight budget, you might consider the micro ATX form factor. ATX motherboards have always been the most popular. ATX is the standard size, and they come fully loaded with high-end features if you have money to spend. The largest form factor, however, is extended ATX or eATX, which is really the SSI EEB server form factor in most cases. The eATX boards are typically only the most extreme boards for over-the-top high-end builds, so most people should not even consider them. Their additional main features over ATX or even mini ITX at this point are pretty limited, and they only fit in really, really big cases. So if you're doing like a showpiece build, maybe eATX, but you really got to be stretching that budget to get eATX. People often mistakenly use the words socket and chipset interchangeably. However, there are often multiple chipsets per CPU socket. AM4 is AMD's current mainstream socket, and all AMD CPUs with the current pin layout, which are all Ryzen chips, fit in the AM4 socket. However, there have been many chipsets since the launch of AM4, from B350 and X370 to B550 and X570. Despite all AM4 CPUs and boards having the same pin layout, not all AM4 CPUs work on all motherboard chipsets within AM4. This is because CPUs require BIOS support from the motherboard manufacturer. If you try to use a CPU that is not supported by the motherboard, you could fry your board, so be sure to use PC Part Picker to determine compatibility between your CPU and motherboard. You will often see a motherboard chipset marketed with its PCI-e generation, PCI-e 5.0, 4.0, 3.0, etc. PCI Express, or PCIe, is an interface standard or slot shape for GPUs, RAID cards, Wi-Fi cards, and certain SSDs. Bandwidth roughly doubles each PCIe generation, meaning transfer speeds of data increase as the generation increases. PCIe 5.0 is supported on Intel Z690 motherboards, but it is a useless feature since there are currently no PCIe 5.0 compatible SSDs or GPUs. Of course, there will be in the future. As such, PCIe 4.0 is the fastest you can use right now, and it is supported on all current mainstream motherboards, including the cheap Intel ones that just came out. PCIe slots also come in different physical sizes: X1, X4, X8, X16, and X32. The number indicates how many PCIe lanes a slot has. The number of lanes determines how much data can be transferred at once. Most GPUs require an X8 or X16 connection, and that's why you should always slot in your GPU in the top PCIe slot on your motherboard. If you put an X16 GPU, like a 3080, in an X8 slot, it will run slowly. Finally, PCIe bifurcation means splitting one slot's lanes into 2 halves. So an X16 slot could support 2 X8 SSDs connected via an add-in SSD card in that one X16 slot. Essentially, make sure that if you have a PCIe 4.0 SSD, you get a PCIe 4.0 or 5.0 motherboard. The same, of course, goes for GPUs. You can run a PCIe 4.0 GPU in a 3.0 slot. It just won't be as fast as it could be. There are dozens of tiny slots and connectors on your motherboard. Make sure you get what you need. For example, if your case has a USB-C slot, you should get a motherboard with a front USB-C header so you can power that slot. Similarly, if you have tons of RGB in your system, make sure your motherboard has lots of ARGB connectors, or just get an ARGB hub. Typically, you will find your rear I/O connectors in the top left of your board. They will face towards the back of your case. You will also find your CPU 8-pin power connector and a massive VRM heatsink that supplies power to the CPU. In the top right, you will find your memory DIMM slots and your motherboard 24-pin connector. In the bottom right, there are SATA ports for hard drives, SSDs, and other internal accessories and peripherals. You'll find front panel headers and internal USB headers. The bottom right also has the chipset, which is a communication interface between your CPU and other components. Sometimes the chipset will have a small fan over it to keep it cool, as is the case with, I think, all original X570 boards, or almost all of them. I think X570S does away with that, but I'm on a bit of a tangent. Finally, the bottom left of a motherboard features PCI-e and M.2 slots, and then in the top middle of your board is a CPU socket. I say bottom left, but the PCI-e and M.2 stuff, they're really like bottom middle, but kind of bottom left. You'll really be able to see when you get a motherboard in hand for the first time. It becomes pretty intuitive. Next, we will move on to features that may make or break your buying decision. The CPU gets its power through a voltage regulator module, or VRM. The VRM ensures that your CPU and GPU receive clean power at a consistent voltage. The VRM converts power supply 12-volt power down to 1.1 to 1.5 volts for your components. Inside the VRM heatsink and or around the CPU socket are MOSFETs, chokes, and capacitors, the three components of a VRM. Modern computers require multi-phase VRMs. The more phases, the more stable the voltage is. Power phases are often labeled 8 plus 2, 12 plus 3, etc. The first number indicates how many phases are dedicated to the CPU, and the second number is the number of phases allocated to all the other components, combined, that is. Often, many boards with more than 8 phases use phase doublers, which increase the number of phases. A 16-phase board using doublers can deliver more power than an 8-phase board without doublers, but the 8-phase board may deliver a more stable voltage depending on the quality of the VRM components. Luckily, you don't have to keep track of all these complicated phrases, as in general, the more money you spend within a motherboard chipset, honestly, the better VRM you get. You may have seen manufacturers market 4-layer, 6-layer, or even 8-layer PCBs, but what does this mean? PCB layers are the conductive copper layers in the board. 4-layer PCBs are the easiest and cheapest to manufacture, while 6-layer and 8-layer PCBs are more expensive. The more PCB layers, the more directly critical traces or connections between components can run, and the better your components will overclock. 6-layer designs are a nice sweet spot, as with 6-layer designs, you can usually find 6-layer B550 ATX boards for around $180 or $160 if you look hard enough. By the way, I would recommend Gigabyte and MSI, ASUS and MSI boards, as I think they're the two most reputable companies, and if you can find a nice ASUS motherboard in your budget, I'd usually go ASUS. They're pretty trustworthy. Every manufacturer has its own basic input/output system, or BIOS. Technically, a BIOS is a chip on your motherboard that allows you to access and set up a computer at the most basic level. However, to most users, the BIOS is really the BIOS setup, or UEFI, which is a program that your computer boots to when it first completes the power on self-test, or post, after you have built it. The BIOS setup allows you to configure hardware settings before you boot into Windows for the first time. The data on a BIOS chip can be updated in two ways. If your board has a BIOS flashback or clear CMOS button, on the that would be on the rear I/O, and you need to update the BIOS for your system to power on, for example, because maybe your CPU is compatible, but you need a BIOS update. Then you can install a new BIOS from the motherboard manufacturer's website onto a USB flash drive using another computer. Then insert the stick into the BIOS flashback USB port on your rear I/O and press that BIOS flashback button. If you do not have this feature, or you do have it, but your computer already powers on, and you still want to update the BIOS, you should still update it occasionally, as BIOS updates can fix issues with your computer that cannot be fixed with new drivers or a system software update. You can update the BIOS on an already functioning computer by installing the BIOS onto a USB stick, then booting into the BIOS setup, inserting the USB stick, and using the firmware update tool to update the BIOS. Some BIOS setup interfaces are better than others. BIOS setups differ in terms of overclocking or other control features, as well as ease of use and general navigability. ASUS generally has the best BIOS setup, but I would not recommend buying a motherboard only because of the ease of use or feature set of its BIOS. Of course, you need to look at all the features of a motherboard, put them together, and then make the best informed buying decision. So don't limit it to the BIOS. There are a lot more features that matter. Every motherboard has 2 to 4 DIMM slots in the top right rather, that house your memory or RAM sticks. Generally speaking, more DIMM slots is better, but it's not that simple. In reality, more memory channels is better. The more channels, the faster the data transfer rate between the DRAM memory and the memory controller on your motherboard. You're best off putting 1 RAM stick per channel. Most ATX and MATX boards have 2 memory channels. So you can use 2 or 4 RAM sticks, but using just 1 will hinder your performance. You also usually want to use slots 2 and 4 if you're using 2 sticks. Not always. Make sure you consult your motherboard manual to see where you should insert your RAM for the best performance. I digress. Most ITX boards with 2 slots nowadays also have 2 channels, so you should populate both slots if you're getting mini ITX. In the rare case both your CPU and motherboard support quad channel memory, you should use 4 RAM sticks to maximize performance. Intel Z690 boards support new DDR5 memory, which has fast transfer speeds but also high latency. Since DDR5 is not much faster than DDR4 but is way more expensive, I would wait until prices and latencies come down before you buy it. Each motherboard can only support 1 generation, either DDR4 or DDR5 of memory, so make sure you get DDR4 memory if you get a DDR4 board, and DDR5 if you get a DDR5 board. Last up are the memory speeds, measured in megahertz, or MHz as you might see them. The faster your RAM, the faster it transfers data to other components. However, most motherboards don't support the fastest RAM speeds, which are about 4400 megahertz and above. So make sure your motherboard and RAM are compatible. I would always recommend enabling XMP or DOCP in the BIOS setup to get the most out of your RAM kit, and this can be done on pretty much any mainstream current generation motherboard. DOCP is usually the AMD version, and XMP is the Intel version. It's just getting your RAM to run at its rated speeds. It's not overclocking, it's not unsafe, as much as NZXT might want you to believe that it is. Motherboards vary greatly in rear I/O connectivity. Cheap motherboards often lack an I/O shield. They also often have less USB ports, slower Ethernet ports, worse audio controllers for the headphone jacks, and no USB-C or BIOS flashback. They also often lack Wi-Fi, which is not necessary for most due to Ethernet, but maybe it is for you. Thunderbolt is a connection interface between a computer and external peripherals. Thunderbolt ports have the USB-C form factor, but they are much faster at transferring data. While this may not sound like a big deal, Thunderbolt ports offer enhanced capabilities for connecting external monitors, external GPUs, external hard drives and SSDs, and more. Thunderbolt 3 is twice as fast as the fastest standard USB-C ports, and the new Thunderbolt 4 is the same speed, but it can transfer more power and data to peripherals. The problem with Thunderbolt is that it's an Intel technology, so only a few select AMD motherboards have it. Additionally, no AMD laptops currently support Thunderbolt at the time of making this video. While it's not a deal breaker, some people genuinely need Thunderbolt, so make sure you align your purchasing decision with your needs and use case. You've probably heard that SLI is dead, but I'll touch on it briefly anyways. NVIDIA SLI and AMD CrossFire are connection technologies that allow 2 of the same GPU model to act as one, increasing performance slightly. AMD CrossFire was eliminated in 2017, while SLI technically still exists, but only on the RTX 3090. Most new motherboards still support both SLI and CrossFire, which can be useful to the two people in the world that either have old AMD GPUs, two of the same one, 2 old NVIDIA GPUs, or 2 top-tier current generation NVIDIA GPUs. So this doesn't apply to that many people, but if you need SLI, I guess make sure you get it. The last motherboard selling point is just generally extra quality of life features. M.2 shields cool your SSD. Postcodes are 2-digit codes that tell you what's wrong with your PC if it won't boot. More USB ports are great. Faster Ethernet. Troubleshooting LEDs, which are similar to postcodes but less specific and less expensive. BIOS flashback, I/O shields, overclocking protections, motherboard water cooling. Some boards have a water lock on the VRM instead of the heatsink. Better audio controllers, RGB, and of course RGB software such as ASUS AuraSync. More M.2 slots for fast SSDs. Built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Front panel headers like front USB-C, and more fan headers. These are all examples of key features that you may genuinely need. Now that I've told you what I believe is everything you need to know about motherboards as a beginner or intermediate PC builder, it's up to you to evaluate what you need and what you want. How much are you willing to spend? Do you want a full-size ATX? Or do you want to save some money and go micro ATX? How many USB ports do you need? Is your RAM compatible with the motherboard you're considering purchasing? Do you need the highest end X570 or Z690 chipset, or will B550 or B660 work for you? These are all questions that you need to answer before buying a motherboard in 2022. Feel free to ask me any questions you may have about a specific motherboard. I would be happy to recommend a board for you that fits your needs and, in my opinion, is good value. Or one of the two, you know. It might fit your needs and you have an unlimited budget, in which case I'll still recommend it for you. Or maybe you don't really have needs, you just need a functioning board, cheap as possible. I got you there too. Thanks for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed everything you need to know about motherboards. Next time, maybe we'll do everything you need to know about RAM. I think that would be a pretty good video, but yeah, let me know, guys. Let me know what you think. See you guys.